Hi, this is Mark from LongIslandWatch.com. Today's video will have zero to do with watches. However, it's about something that I truly love, which is aviation. When we go to the shows, a lot of people ask me how getting my pilot's license is going, and they'll ask various questions, unless of course they're pilots and they know, well, they'll still ask how it's going, but they'll know more of the finer details. And I also find that in conversation, just a lot of people ask questions about it, and I figured, hey, why not do a little video on my aviation journey from nothing to getting my pilot's license, and now I'm currently in instrument training. Might be interesting to people. I love to break topics down so people can understand them a little bit better. So my journey with aviation obviously starts from when I was a kid. I loved airplanes. I loved going on trips. I loved being in the window seat. I loved watching the flaps go down and all the other stuff that happens with airliners. And I always did want to fly a plane, maybe not as a profession, although I don't recall, but certainly engineering was my thing. But then when I graduated and I started working, I kind of shelved the whole flying thing. I did pick up an interest in it later on, and well, it's just really expensive, to be brutally and perfectly honest. And if you're not going to do it as a profession, it's a hell of an investment just to do something for fun. Just to give you an idea, I mean, it'll vary all over the country, but you can easily spend 20 to 30 grand just to get, step one of the PPL, which is the private pilot's license, which is the most basic, kind of basic. And there's sport licenses and stuff, but you don't find much of that around where I fly. That's the most basic kind of license. And then if you're going to progress into the airlines, you have to go get your instrument, you got to get your commercial, you got to get your multi, ATP rated, all this other stuff, and that just costs a ton of money. So like I said, unless it's going to be your career, it's not really an investment. It's just money you spend for fun. Eventually, I did, through the good graces of this business, the LongIslandWatch.com business, I eventually was able to afford to pay for flight lessons. However, my wife was not really on board with me doing it. Obviously, there is a concern in what we call general aviation. Part 91 is what people refer to it as. There's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of numbers that people throw around. If you don't know what it means, just ask somebody. But Part 91 is basically general aviation. It's what people like me fly under. It's a regulation. Part 91 meaning the part of the regulation that my flying pertains to. I'm not for hire, kind of just doing it for fun. I can't take any money. That would be a commercial license, which I don't have. You'll hear people talk about Part 91, Part 121, Part 135. Part 121 is the airlines. Part 135 typically is like charter jets and stuff, or charter airlines. But anyway, eventually I was able to afford it. And like I said, eventually my wife also relented because I was constantly nagging her. And it's kind of serendipitous that I'm doing this video now because it was 3 years ago to the weekend that I took my first discovery flight. And if you're interested in possibly becoming a pilot or just want to, I say fart around in the air, putz around, whatever you want to do, I recommend taking a discovery flight at a flight school. A discovery flight simply means that you hop in, you sit left seat, which typically is a pilot in command seat, but you sit left seat and the instructor comes with you, and the instructor will, taxi, take off, but then you get to have your hand at the controls for a bit, then you'll come back in and, maybe you'll kind of do some of the approach and then the instructor will take the landing. However, it's called the discovery flight for a reason because it's to discover if you love it. So I took my discovery flight Memorial Day weekend, 2022. Ironically, it was, I fly out of Republic Airport here on Long Island, KFRG is the sign. And it's the same airport that for the Memorial Day weekend air show, it's the one that the Blue Angels typically fly out of. It happened to be the Blue Angels were parked there that day. So it was pretty awesome seeing them when you're actually, on the runway and you could see other planes and they're planes that you kind of know. Awesome. But anyway, that was the start of my journey. I was hooked and I wanted to do it more. So what happens after you decide, yeah, I'm going to do this? Well, the first thing you kind of got to do, and this is unfortunate, is you have to go get a medical certificate. There's three classes: third class, second class, first class. Depending on what you're going to do, don't worry about all that stuff. Your instructor will tell you which one to get. But you have to go for a medical exam by an FAA-approved doctor. and I never really thought about this, but I'd already fallen in love, and now I have to go. And you have to go give your entire medical history. You can't lie, because if you're ever found out later, you're done. You're going to lose your license. And it turns out that not that you have to be in extreme physical fitness, but there's a lot of things you can't have. Mental illness is definitely one of them you can't have, which I don't. Any other issues with that? General health and well-being, color blindness, you can't have to a degree, this and that. Definitely research it before you get into it. But anyway, so you go get a medical, and then you have a medical certificate, and that gets mailed to you. And yay! So now you have a med, and you have to fill out a form to become a student pilot. You get a little ID card, which looks just like a pilot's, like a PPL card, but it just basically indicates that you're a student pilot. And eventually one day when you pass your exam, that you get another card that says you're an actual pilot. You have that, you have your medical, you have your little student pilot card, and then you have to do two things, okay? You have to do flight training, obviously, and you also have to take a written exam. The written exam, typically it's recommended that you take the written exam, before you start really flight training in earnest, so that you can just get it done and out of the way. You can attend two kinds of schools. This is where a lot of confusion comes in. There's Part 61 schools, and there's Part 141 schools. Again, that whole part of regulation stuff. Part 61 schools, more like a learn-as-you-go kind of school. Part 141 schools, more of a structured classroom setting. So Part 61 schools, which is what I did, you have to take the written test on your own, and you have to learn the material on your own, typically. So you can do an at-home study course, which is what I did. I use something called King's School of Aviation, or King's, whatever they are. It's this old, very old couple, husband and wife, John and Martha. And you just watch a whole series of videos, and eventually you study, and you take the written test, and you have to get a 70 to pass. It's recommended, though, that you get far above a 70, because the more questions you get wrong, when you finally go for your final person-to-person test, which we'll talk about in a minute, when you finally go for that, the more questions you got wrong, the more they're going to grill you on this stuff you didn't know. So you have to take a written, and you pass the written. And then you start all the flight training. Now, I'd mentioned that there's two kinds of schools, a Part 61 and a Part 141. The exact training that you need, or the requirements that you need to meet to qualify to take the final test, vary between both schools. They're similar, but they do vary, so you need to, hopefully your school knows the regulations, you need to know what they are. But typically, you have to fly around 40 hours of dual received. Dual received means there is an instructor, you're the student, and they are teaching you around 40. It could be more, it could be less, but it's kind of what it is. Keep in mind, to rent a plane, a standard trainer like a 172 or a low-wing Piper or something is typically, where I am, 200 about an hour, 200 wet, which means it includes fuel, so 200 wet an hour, plus the instructor, 60, 70, 80 bucks an hour. So you could do the math, add it up, multiply by the number of hours you need. It's expensive, right? So you need a certain number of hours, and you also need a certain number of, you need to do takeoffs and landings at night you gotta fulfill. Nighttime has its own definition. You need to do a solo, right? You need to solo a number of hours. Now, I remember my solo. You can solo well before, well, most people do, you solo well before the amount of hours you have when you take your final test, a practical exam or so. I soloed around 90 hours. Yeah, it's a lot, and I'll tell you why. If you're gonna do it, you be dedicated. Do still have a job. I have to run a business. So there are weeks where I flew maybe 1 hour a week. Sometimes I didn't even fly, or maybe one flight a week, or weeks I didn't even fly, weather, whatever. Family interruptions, business interruptions, and the less often you fly, the harder it is for the next flight for you to kind of get your mind and your muscle memory back into what you're doing. So it took me a while to solo. I soloed at around 90 or so, and then I passed my final at like 115 or 120 or so. Once you solo, it goes quick, but solo just means you go up by yourself. I remember it, big day, it was in September of 2023. And you just fly the pattern. You do 3 takeoffs and landings. and that's your solo requirement. Then you start doing what's called cross-country. Cross-country is defined as a trip where the originating and what's the word I'm looking for? Where the originating airport and your destination airport are more than 50 nautical miles apart. That's a cross-country. Start doing cross-countries, and then eventually do a cross-country solo. There's a long cross-country solo, which has to be more than 150 miles, all by yourself. I mean, it kind of is scary. It's really scary. It's exciting and scary. I flew from Republic to Groton to Bridgeport and back. You have to do a long, and then you have to do a number of hours at cross-country time. I went to Poughkeepsie a couple of times, did a couple other things. And you basically need to fulfill all these requirements. And once you fulfill all these requirements, you are ready to take the practical exam. And the practical exam is given by typically what's known as a DPE, a designated pilot examiner. They don't work for the FAA. They're contracted by the FAA to give the exam. And the exam focuses, there's two main aspects, right? There is a oral, where you sit across the desk from the person and they just ask you questions. And I mean, my examiner happened to be a really, really, really sweet guy, really nice. I was intimidated originally, but once he started talking, I was like, wow, okay, this guy's really nice. And he's not trying to trip me up. He's literally just asking questions. And the end game is for you not to know everything. You should. Nobody knows everything. You're never going to know everything they're going to ask you. But you need to have a general idea and understanding of how things work, various airspaces and stuff. And the rules that we fly under are called VFR, visual flight rules. So we have to have certain cloud conditions, certain sky conditions to be able to fly. And then if you pass that part, you then go to the practical test, which is the test flight, right? So now you're back in the left seat in the plane, pilot in command, and the DPE he or she will sit in the right seat, and they'll start instructing you. They'll say, okay, let's go. Let's take off. We're gonna go here. I want you to do, you have to prove a bunch of different maneuvers, and it's all written in the ACS, Airman Certification Standards, and there's a billion things you gotta know. It looks like a lot, but then when you really break it all down, it's kind of not that much, but you have to just prove everything to the standards that you can do it. Slow flight, power off stalls, power on stalls, steep turns, standard landings, short field landings, soft field landings, short field takeoffs, soft field takeoffs. I'm just kind of doing this all from memory. There's a bunch of different things you have to demonstrate that you can do to within acceptable criteria. You do that, you land. I landed, I remember, Mike, my DPE, I landed, and we had done, I know in my head, we had done all the requirements. We land, and I go to taxi off to go back to do another takeoff, and he's like, "No, we're done. We're gonna go. We're going back." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." He's like, "You passed." He's like, "You did a great job." I was like, "Oh my God, thank you, thank you so much." And then it turns out he really had to pee, so he bolted out of the plane and went to the bathroom. But that was it. And then after that, you get a satisfactory sign off in your logbook. You have a logbook where you log every flight. You log the number of hours you do, what kind of flying it was. Was it daytime? Was it nighttime? Was it cross-country time? Were you pilot in command? Was it dual received? Was it dual given if you're an instructor? All these things. And it's your memory, your log. And it's not required to have a logbook. It's required to make entries. I still remember all this stuff because the training is still fresh. You're required to make entries whenever it's something that's towards another certification or endorsement or something. Getting your private pilot license, you have to record everything that gets you to the number of hours required. However, once you're flying, you don't really need to log anything. So my story, that was November of 2024, I got my private. So it took me about 30 months. I'll be honest, again, about 8 or 9 of those months, I totally did not fly. I screwed up my back, herniated a disc, and just physically couldn't sit in a cockpit for a while. But once I got back into it, I finished it all up in like 3 months. I had enough. Because what's also important is that your written exam, once you take it, you have 2 years to pass the practical part of the test, to finish everything. And if you don't, you have to retake the written. And I didn't want to go through ground school all over again and retake the written exam. So where am I now? Got my license in November of 2024. Yes, amazing, time flies, right? Day before Thanksgiving. I then went and did one solo flight by myself. I think I just stayed in the pattern and just did some takeoffs and landings just to kind of make sure I knew what I was doing, I guess. And then after that, I decided to transition to a different type of aircraft. Now, that aircraft is a Cirrus, which a lot of people who definitely are in aviation will know. Sometimes Cirrus pilots are given a negative connotation, but it is an awesome plane. There's a school on my field, Nassau Flyers. They fly only Cirrus aircraft. I transitioned, what they call it, I transitioned to a Cirrus. That only took about 13 hours or so of flight time. And that was it. And then a Cirrus, I can fly a Cirrus now. There's no special endorsements or anything to fly a Cirrus. I just need approval that you can take it out for a spin. And I do local cross countries. Like I said, I've gone to Poughkeepsie still. I still go to Groton, kind of just still going around. I've gone for breakfast. They call it there's a phrase called a $100 hamburger. It's really now like the $300 or $500 hamburger. That's you take your instructor and you guys fly somewhere and you grab something to eat. And because it costs so much freaking money to fly a plane, it's the $500 hamburger. So I've done that, a lot of fun stuff. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm just starting my instrument training now. I actually am taking the written exam for instrument training the end of this week, and then I will start my actual flight training for instruments in a Cirrus. I'm looking forward to that. What does instrument rating get you? It just means you can fly in what's known as IMC, Instrument Meteorological Conditions, or IFR, Instrument Flight Rules. And it just means you are flying by the instruments in the cockpit with no external references to the outside world except for taxi, takeoff, and then for short approach landing. Other than that, you shouldn't be able to look outside. And one of the things you have to do, which totally blows my mind in the regulations, is you have to do a 250-mile cross country with just 100% looking at the gauges. So you're what they call under the hood. So you can't see out the glass. You can only look at your gauges for the entire trip, which is a couple hours. Obviously, you have a safety pilot who's your instructor with you, but that to me is kind of insane. I'm looking forward to it. And everyone tells me, and I'm sure people will chime in, that getting your instrument rating is one of the smartest things you can do because it just makes you a safer pilot. You learn much more about the weather, and then certainly a lot more about the air traffic control system and funneling of traffic to and from airports. Let's see. I think that's about it. I think something that's also interesting is how is the number of flight hours calculated? How do you know how many hours you flew? There's a meter, it's called the Hobs Meter, and typically the Hobs Meter is active. Every planes are different, but usually it's like whenever oil pressure is flowing, like if it's tied to the oil pressure switch. So if I'm flying out of Republic on a busy day, right, and Republic it's called a Class Delta, it's Class Delta airspace, which is not supposed to be all that busy, but it is freaking busy. It's a lot busier than MacArthur, which is a Class Charlie Class Charlie airport, where like Southwest and big jets fly out of. No big jets fly out of Republic, except for like the Islanders every so often on a 757, I think, and the Blue Angels. But you can be on the ground for 30 to 40 minutes waiting to take off, and your engine's running, so that's Hobbs time. That is actually considered flight time. Kind of sucks because you're paying for it also, but you're not really flying. So something to take into consideration as well. If you're looking for a flight school, just take into consideration where you're going to do it, what traffic is like in the area, also the weather. Long Island gets fall and spring windy as hell. Winter, it kind of sucks. Summer's a great time usually, but you just got to pick your poison. There's parts of this country like the Southwest where it's flying is just. I hear a plane right now. I guess I'm right near Republic. Awesome. The winds are, just a few knots at most, whereas around here, 15 gusting 20 or whatever, and that'll make me stay in my seat and not go up. Anyway, that's it. This has been Mark from LongIslandWatch.com, just sharing with you my aviation journey. I hope you find it interesting. I have it in my mind to record a flight one day. I don't want to talk to the camera at all because I am 100% focused on flying. But I think I would maybe record a flight from behind and just, B-roll the entire thing at the end. And then you could also obviously hear my comms, which is, I know the video's over, but that's one of the scariest things that, for me actually, when I started learning, was not the flying of the plane. I'll be honest with you, takeoff is easy. Flying is easy. Landing is hard. It takes a while. I still can't land consistently well. And not many pilots can. They'll tell you, oh, that landing sucked. They'll know. Comms were the real thing that scared me because they speak so fast. The terms are not terms that everyone, they don't use them in regular everyday lingo. And that was my fear. But after like 20 or 30 hours, I go to YouTube videos, I listen to comms, and then you kind of get it. But anyway, that's it. markforlonghours.com, aviation journey. I'll do more videos probably about this if you find them interesting. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.